Panama is a country split in half by the most famous ditch in the world, the Panama Canal. But there's another divide most people don't know about. See, if you trace Panama's history, you'll find footprints from Africa everywhere. In its music, in its food, in its slang, even in its revolutions. And yet, when you look at Panama today, the story of its black population feels hidden, distorted, almost erased. So, what happened? What happened to the black people in Panama? Let's talk about it. Panama has always been black history. Africans arrived here almost at the same moment Europeans did. In fact, the first records of enslaved Africans in Panama date to 1513, barely a year after Vasco Nunez crossed the isthmus himself. That makes Panama one of the earliest ports of the transatlantic slave trade in the Americas. What were they brought for? To move Spain's treasure. See, Panama was never about plantations. It was about logistics. It was a choke point of empire, the shortcut between Peru's silver mines and Spain's royal vaults. Gold and silver were carried from South America, dragged across the Panamanian isthmus by caravans of indigenous laborers and enslaved Africans, then loaded onto ships bound for Europe. But slavery breeds resistance, and in Panama, resistance became legend. By the mid-1500s, thousands of enslaved Africans had fled into the mountains and jungles, forming what we now call maroon settlements. These weren't ragtag camps. They were organized, armed, and independent. The most famous was led by Bayano, a man so feared by the Spanish that his very name became shorthand for rebellion. Bayano commanded hundreds of fighters, waging a guerrilla war through Panama's dense forests. His forces raided Spanish caravans, attacked settlements, and carved out territory the empire couldn't control. And Bayano was not alone. Different maroon groups formed alliances with European rivals, most famously with the English privateer Francis Drake in the 1570s. Imagine the irony, the Spanish crown, richest empire on earth, being undermined by its own runaway slaves working hand in hand with pirates. The Maroons were so disruptive that Spain had to do something unthinkable: negotiate. In 1579, the crown signed a peace treaty with one Maroon group, granting them autonomy in exchange for ending their raids. In other words, black rebels forced the Spanish Empire to recognize their independence. This was the backdrop of Panama long before there was a canal or a republic. Africans were the muscle behind Spain's empire. Maroons were the thorn in its side, and black resistance was ongoing and very significant. So, when we say Panama has always been black history, we mean it. From the very first ships to the first rebellions, black people were central to labor, to resistance, to shaping the destiny of the isthmus itself. Now, fast forward 3 centuries, Panama became the world's most expensive shortcut. The French tried first in the 1880s, dreaming of another Suez Canal, but the jungle had other plans. Yellow fever and malaria ripped through their workers, and by the time the French gave up, 20,000 men were dead. Enter the United States. After staging a convenient independence, for Panama in 1903, Washington seized control of the project. But to dig the canal, America needed cheap labor. Where did they find it? The Caribbean. Tens of thousands of men were shipped in from Barbados, Jamaica, Martinique, Trinidad, and St. Lucia. By 1913, over 80% of the canal's workforce was West Indian black laborers. They did the blasting, the digging, the back-breaking jobs no one else would touch. And how did the U.S. reward them? With Jim Crow, of course, America's specialty, especially at this time. Canal workers were divided into 2 classes. The gold roll, mostly white Americans and Europeans. They were paid in gold, given housing, benefits, and medical care. And then there was the silver roll, overwhelmingly black West Indians. Paid in silver, they were shoved into segregated barracks, fed worse food, and denied the perks of their white counterparts. One Jamaican laborer wrote, "We built the canal with our sweat, our tears, and our bones. But when it opened, they told us we could not even swim in it." By the time the canal was completed in 1914, over 25,000 workers were dead from disease, landslides, and brutal conditions. Most of them black, and the black West Indians that remained became a part of Panama. Entire neighborhoods of Panama City and Colonial grew out of their communities. They brought their languages, churches, music, food. Today, if you hear Panamanians celebrating Congo traditions, if you taste Caribbean spice in the cooking, if you hear the music at Carnival, it's because of those canal workers. Yet, despite shaping the nation, they were treated as outsiders. The Panamanian elite often looked down on them, calling them Antillanos. Laws were passed restricting their immigration. Schools sometimes barred their children. The very people who built the economic backbone of the country were painted as a threat to national identity. So when we talk about the Panama Canal as one of the modern wonders of the world, remember, it was dug with black shovels, and it was paid for in black lives. After the last shovel hit dirt in 1914, the Panama Canal became the nation's lifeline. But for the Black West Indian laborers who stayed behind, life was far from smooth sailing. Instead of gratitude, they got excluded from society. Panama's elites, mostly of Spanish descent, saw West Indians as outsiders. They weren't seen as true Panamanians. In fact, in the 1920s and 30s, laws were passed to limit their immigration and restrict their rights. Some schools flat out denied entry to children with English-speaking Caribbean parents. Imagine that. You've built the canal that the entire nation survives on, but your kid can't even get into the local school. The irony is, by then, Afro-Caribbeans had already shaped Panama's identity. In Colonial, you heard calypso and reggae drifting through the streets. Churches rang with Caribbean gospel. Kitchens smelled of Jamaican patties alongside Panamanian dishes. But the government was busy writing laws trying to erase them. It was political. Panamanian nationalism in the early 20th century was about separating the nationals from the foreigners. And guess who got shoved into the foreigner box? Black people from the Antilles. Still, Afro-Caribbeans pushed back. They formed unions, they started community schools when official ones shut them out. They fought for citizenship and equal recognition, and slowly their presence became undeniable. By mid-century, many Afro-Panamanians were bilingual, navigating English and Spanish, linking Panama to both the Caribbean and the Americas. But even as they carved out space in Panamanian society, the state continued to treat them as a problem. Afro-Panamanians were overrepresented in the poorest neighborhoods, underrepresented in politics, and constantly battling stereotypes of being lazy, criminal, or foreign, despite being citizens for generations. This tension between rejection and belonging defined the 20th century for Black Panamanians. They were building the culture of the nation even while the nation denied their place in it. If the canal made Panama famous, Afro-Panamanians made it soulful. From the streets of Colon came reggae and Espanol, Panama's gift to Latin America. Before reggaeton conquered the world, Afro-Panamanian artists were fusing Jamaican rhythms with Spanish lyrics. And in Carnival, the Congo dances rooted in enslaved Africans mocking their colonizers still dominate the parades. What was once rebellion is now national pride. The irony, the same culture once dismissed as foreign is now stamped on every tourism brochure. The nation sells what it once tried to silence. Here's the heartbreak wrapped in irony. The country built by Black hands has spent centuries acting like those hands never existed. Take Colon, often called Black Panama, a city rich in history, poor in government investment. Schools crumble, hospitals are run down, and unemployment soars. The people who power the canal are now bypassed by prosperity. But perhaps the deepest form of erasure was statistical. In 2010, for the first time, Panama's national census asked, does anyone in this home consider themselves Black or Afro-descendant? Respondents could self-identify as Colonial Black, West Indian Black, or other. Still, only 9.2% of Panama identified as Black. Even activists said the number was grossly inaccurate. Many people didn't recognize the term or feared what declaring Black might cost them. You ever seen those people who are as dark as me, but identify as white? Yeah, they're from places like Panama or other Latin American countries that literally erase the category. I cannot begin to explain to you the psychosis that occurs in the mind of a people with a forcefully stripped identity. But there are people who can, and I'll recommend them. By 2023, something shifted. Improved data collection and rising self-identification pushed the number of Afro-descendants to 31%, nearly 1 in 3 Panamanians. That is a reckoning, a generation saying we exist and we've always been here. But getting counted didn't undo centuries of neglect. The same communities still bear the scars, poverty, lack of access, and invisibility in the halls of power. Because forgetting Black people wasn't the only goal. They also wanted to silence anyone who remained. And even today, Panama is still learning, sometimes painfully, how to stop pretending Black lives aren't its own. The Panama Canal is the world's headline, but for Afro-Panamanians, the canal was just a prologue. They are the descendants of enslaved Africans, of Caribbean migrants, of freedom fighters, who built not just the locks and the rails of the canal, but the culture, the rhythm, the soul, and food of Panama, okay? The story of Black Panama was buried in census boxes, ignored in textbooks, treated like an afterthought in politics. But here's the truth. Panama isn't Panama without Black people, not historically, not culturally, not demographically. And that story isn't just Panama's. Across the Americas, from Afro-Venezuelans along the coast to Garifuna in Central America, the Black Colombians, Haitians, Jamaicans, even African Americans. Our histories share the same core: invisibility, struggle, survival. What happened to black people in Panama is part of what happened to black people everywhere in the Americas. We were central to the nation's creation and then erased from the nation's imagination. But invisibility isn't the same as absence, because Panama's black communities are still there, louder, prouder, and finally being counted as of 3 years ago, 2.5. What the fuck? What happened to the black people? Y'all been hiding them in census records for 100 years. 100 years. Me calling people black is just easier for me to identify people as an American, right? But Americans, like, ideas when it comes to race is really fucking wild and crooked and just incongruent with the rest of the world. Because, like, a significant population of people who call themselves black here in America, they would not be black in Brazil. They wouldn't be black in Panama. They wouldn't be black in Venezuela. You know what I'm saying? What America did is just like, yo, if you got any percentage of African ancestry in you at all, you could be way closer to my skin tone, but since you have a percentage of black in your black. And it's just like, it doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense. The way America identifies race is silly. I know plenty of black people who are about a quarter black and mostly white, but they're not called white, they're called black. Maybe their roots are, they got 4C hair texture, or you know what I'm saying, they got real pale features, but then their nose and their lips kind of give like some phenotypical traits. You know what I'm saying? Like this. All right, we ending this video, bro. Bye.